the show Put It on the Table.
That's an excellent name. Put It on the Table. I like that name. Welcome back to Put It on the Table. This is the second episode. Last episode, we talked about a bunch of stuff that we were ready to talk about, answered one or two preliminary questions. And so here we go. We're going to crack into it. So what's the first question you've got for me?
Yeah, so I guess largely in today in America, the death penalty is sort of like a really huge topic, and it's really polarized. You know, people are either one way or the other, really. But I guess sort of beyond the American politics, what does the Bible say about the death penalty?
Well, so you've read Exodus. So what do you remember about the death penalty being in Exodus?
We didn't really talk about that too much in the class, so we sort of skimmed over that, so I honestly don't really remember too much.
Well, the Bible actually says a whole lot about the death penalty, especially in Exodus, but also in Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Okay.
Now, so Exodus being the book in which Moses gets everybody out of Egypt, and they make an exodus. Leviticus is the book that is for the Levites, the priests. And Deuteronomy is basically kind of a combination of a few things, but largely it is a law book and a bit of history. So, yeah, just as sort of the short answer before we really dig into it, the Bible is in support of the death penalty. Spoiler alert, people die. And there's no reason the death penalty should be abolished by biblical standards. Just now we're going to get really specific into this and nitpicky, so prepare for some crazy things. Now, but as we're going to, before we really get into the nitpicky and less fun stuff, I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you a list of things. So this is just some of the things, not an extensive list, but this is a list of things that will get you killed according to the Old Testament. Here we go. If you murder someone, you die. If your animal kills a bunch of people, and and you've been ordered to restrain it, and then you fail to restrain it, so it escapes and then kills more than one person, you die, and your animal dies.
Interesting.
Specifically an ox, but it's probably true of all animals. I don't have a great piece of evidence for that, but if your horse did it, probably also counts. If a man commits adultery with a married woman, they both die.
Oh, okay.
If you work on the Sabbath, you die. If you injure your parents, you die. If you kidnap someone, you die. If you curse your parents, you die. If you strike a woman so that she has a miscarriage, you die. Now, similarly, this is related to the death penalty. If a thief breaks into your house, you can beat them to death, but only under certain circumstances, assuming it is during the break-in and at night. You can beat them to death.
That's interesting.
If you allow a sorceress to live, you die. If you have sex with an animal, you die. If you sacrifice to any god other than the Lord, you die. So, yeah, that's not even an exhaustive list.
Don't do anything. Don't do anything we just talked about.
Don't do anything we just talked about. Also, don't beat a thief to death. We'll get to sort of what the deal with all these death penalties is and where did those go. We'll get to that in a moment. But those were things that you could be killed for in the Old Testament.
Wow.
So the death penalty is part of the law. Now, for people who aren't super versed in sort of biblical themes, the Bible consists of basically two major things that we care about, other than, obviously the Old Testament and the New Testament. But particularly, it consists of law and gospel. Now, the law, the death penalty, is part of that law. And that mirrors our sin. And it shows us our need for the gospel. Because we know we cannot be perfect, because the law has shown us that. And that makes the death penalty a very important part of the law of God. But the question that you asked wasn't about the law of God. It was about, broader, more in a broader sense, a secular government. What about secular governments? That is a more complex question, because in the law of God, obviously, death penalty is right there, written in, this is what you die for.
Yep. Don't let any of your oxen loose.
Yes, absolutely, under no circumstances. And if you get warned for your ox already having murdered a couple of people, and then that's like, you're running out of chances.
Yeah.
But so the basic question then that we're really looking at with the secular government death penalty is, what's the purpose of the government in Christian doctrine? Because additionally, the death penalty in the Old Testament doesn't really qualify anymore, which is a lot of people support the death penalty with Old Testament texts. But the Old Testament was a sacrificial law, was intended so that basically you could atone for your sins. But Jesus then came and did that.
Right.
He said very specifically, not even a stroke of a letter of the law will be removed, ever. However, sacrifices, various things that you had to do to atone yourself for sins, gone. That's there because, not because the law no longer counts, but because Jesus has now fulfilled all of those parts of the law for eternity. You know, you and I,
like, he rewrote the playbook on sin, almost, on how it relates to humans.
Yeah. He defeated sin. He killed sin. Sin is now dead.
Yeah.
Thanks to Jesus. Because he qualified us.
Right.
We did not qualify ourselves by any means. So, secular government, death penalty. If the Bible doesn't even, use the death penalty by the time Jesus is gone, and he says, now the law is fulfilled, what's with the death penalty for a secular government? What role does the government have? Now, this basic question sort of props up a couple of things, and so we believe that all power comes from God. The Bible says all power and all authority on the planet Earth comes from God. So, as whether we like it or not, or whether we understand it or not, everyone who has power or authority was given that authority by God. Which is not to say, so, brief disclaimer, the divine right of kings is not the same thing. That is a different set of things than all authority comes from God, which is where the divine right of kings came from, by the way. Because authority comes from God, so therefore the king must have the divine right.
Exactly.
Sort of true, but the king was given that authority by God, and thus must answer to God for that authority.
It's sort of more like they've been given a right by the divine, not they've been given a divine right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is an excellent way of looking at it. Now, that's so in Romans 13, so we're going to pop the Bible open here, and we're going to be in the Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the Romans, the church in Rome. And so Romans 13. I'm not super familiar with how small the text is in this Bible. I normally use an electronic one, but so here we go. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Now, that in layman's terms, for what we care about with the death penalty, that includes the power to punish. They said, very specifically, Paul wrote, the government is an avenger, and the government does not bear the sword in vain.
Yes.
And we need the government because mankind fell and is sinful. We are not good people, and that's the point.
Exactly.
So, the government is there as a not person. The government is not a person. It is an entity that is designed to keep us in check because of the authority of God. So,
I think that's interesting. I think it's also a theme that I think it shows up in also just a lot of texts sort of coming from the Bible, if I remember right. That's also a theme in the Quran as well, as respecting the government and the law of the land and the culture of the land that you're in. And I think that sort of idea is really prominent.
Well,
I think it's really interesting to see that overlap.
yeah, it is very interesting. And there's also the secular idea that shows up, that one of the major functions of religion in society is to keep society melded together.
Yeah.
Which, depending on how you interpret it, isn't necessarily secular. You don't have to view it as a secular thing.
Right.
I think religion does tie societies together very strongly. A community of Christians, or anybody who is of the same religion, tends to be a stronger community.
Definitely.
Anyway, so not only does it have the power to punish, though, the government has more than just the power to punish. It also has the right to create its authority and to enforce that authority.
Okay.
So we call that today legislative and executive power. That's very simply.
Right.
And because of those two things, implicitly it has judicial power. So that is in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. And I'm just going to pop that out. I really should have written those. And in retrospect, I should have written those on this sheet. That would have been really nice to just have the quote.
We're getting some nice page flips on the camera.
We're getting
stock
excellent
footage.
page flips. Yeah, look at me. I am really excellent at flipping the page and not finding what I'm looking for. All right, here we go. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good.
Okay.
So, basically, as governors and emperors, and these things are all valid by Peter,
Totally.
we are subject to what they decree, and how they choose to enforce that decree, which you come to a fine line in some of those things, because on the one hand, it is a good thing to be persecuted. Ultimately, it is a good thing, because it means that you are so properly with Christ that the world cannot accept you and beats you up.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. And actually, just another video that will be coming out this week. The apostles all get beat up and they're happy about it.
Wow.
They're like, yes, the high priest beat us up.
Your
Yes!
fist is the face of God.
We're being persecuted in Jesus' name. This is wonderful.
This must have been what Jesus felt like.
Yeah, and so, which, now legislative and executive power, and the power to punish, still doesn't include the death penalty necessarily, right?
Right.
We haven't gotten there yet, and that brings us there, to capital punishment. So does the government, apart from the law of God, have the right to put people to death? Good question. In Romans 13, if you remember, it said that the government is an avenger and brings wrath to wrongdoers. So God also gives the right in Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds a man's blood, his blood will be shed by man, for God made man in his image. So God says, you murder somebody, you die. That's just kind of how it works, which is generally true.
Yeah.
Or at least for most of human history has been generally true. People who kill people tend to die.
It's true.
They tend to be killed off themselves. So, it is a decree, but there is argument that exists as to whether it's a really hard and fast law decree, or whether it's more of a prophetic decree and saying that will happen to people who murder people. Doesn't really matter. It's not that important, honestly, because
it sort of sets up like either God can take care of it or the governing body can.
Kind of.
Like regardless of that, I think it was sort of like saying like there will be some sort of punishment.
There's a consequence.
Yeah, there is a consequence.
It is setting precedent for consequence. And this idea of the consequence for murder being death is repeated over and over in the Bible. And so, but in modern light, we're not in the Bible anymore. We are a few good years past the end of the Bible at this point.
A couple thousand.
Other than say the prophecies in Revelations about the end of the world, which have obviously not yet quite come to fruition, we are past pretty much the historical content of the Bible. So, what does it mean in modern life? Well, it's important to identify certain legalistic pieces of the Old Testament, because, like I said, God fulfilled a lot of those in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So, we aren't necessarily putting people to death for sleeping with a married woman or having an uncontrollable animal. No. Like those aren't things that we do, because we don't exist in a society that follows necessarily the law of God. We follow the law of the government, the secular law, which both have a place, because, like I said, the government is an avenger. The government has this purpose, and the law of God is primarily to show us that we need the gospel. So they have two different purposes largely. And the Lutheran Church, specifically, maintains the source of power of government comes from God. And that's generally accepted. But also, its form of rule is vested in the people. So to some degree, we and the government jointly decide whether or not the death penalty is appropriate in certain cases.
Okay.
And that is provided it does not conflict with the Word of God.
So it's sort of like a cultural thing within the bounds of the Bible and God.
Yes. So the final answer, the final short answer here is the death penalty is theologically appropriate in many cases.
Okay.
But the government is the source of human law and punishment. So, in other words, the death penalty is not necessarily wrong. It's also not necessarily the required thing, because we are talking about a secular government. But it is completely appropriate.
Okay.
And once again, we are coming to the end of our section here. We've got another time. I'm looking at the clock here, and so we will be talking more about the death penalty next time and sort of the history of it, as I recall. So come back next time. We'll see you next week, and on Put It on the Table. See you then. Hi, and thank you for watching that episode of Put It on the Table. If you liked it, go ahead and tell us so. If you have a question you'd like to ask, go ahead and ask it in the comments. And if you'd like to see more videos just like it, go ahead and click that cross in the middle of the screen. Thank you again.